Hello, everyone. Welcome to Day by Day, a history podcast. I'm Noah Davis, and I am the host of Day by Day, and this is our first episode. Now, a little bit about how this is going to go before we get started. Like I mentioned a bit in the trailer, we are going to be looking at not just what happened on this day in history, but we're going to be looking at what happened in the kind of surrounding days. So today, we're going to be looking at November 1st through November 3rd, and we're going to be talking about what happened on these days. Now, today, we're going to be talking about the creation of the European Union. We're going to be talking about the Balfour Declaration, and we'll be talking about Sputnik 2. First and foremost, though, we'll talk about the creation of the European Union. This happens November 1st of 1993 in the Netherlands. Now, coming out of the destruction of World War II, Europe is looking to form some sort of unity. This desire for unity isn't necessarily new to the post-World War II world. Before, we see a lot of this coming after World War I. World War I was the first industrialized war, right? We have never had damage even comparable to what happens in World War I before. This is also a very big game changer for Europe. Europe sees a lot of change following World War I. So first, we have the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire following the end of the war. This creates Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Austria, and Yugoslavia. And we also see a lot of shakeups in the Balkans. Romania and Italy are going to gain land, so a lot of changes. On top of that, the German Empire and the Ottoman Empire end. We'll talk a little bit more about the Ottoman Empire later in the episode, but upon the empire being broken up, Turkey, Syria, Mesopotamia, and Palestine are all created, and a lot of those are going to fall under the jurisdiction of European countries, which we'll get to later. Other countries created are going to be Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Finland. Now, a lot of this isn't necessarily just because of World War I, but it also has to do with the Russian Revolution, which we're going to be talking about next week. Following World War I, we see an extremely divided and damaged Europe. This kind of brings on this desire for international cooperation. We want to try to avoid any future conflict. US President Woodrow Wilson is a very big proponent of this. He is going to bring up his 14 points. These points that are going to aim for a more unified world, trying to avoid these large scale conflicts. Now, part of Wilson's 14 points is going to be a big inspiration for setting up the League of Nations. The League is a little bit closer to being a forerunner for the United Nations than of the European Union, but it does kind of show that we are aiming for this kind of global unity, or at least local unity. The League of Nations is created, but it is plagued with issues from the start. Even though Woodrow Wilson was a very big advocate for this to be created, he goes back to the US after kind of giving these speeches in Europe, and it's not very popular back home. Congress ends up kind of going against joining the League of Nations. They want to try to go a little bit more isolationist, not really get involved in these foreign affairs as much, especially after they just joined World War I. And so they are not going to join. Now, this represents a big issue. The United States, coming out of World War I, is going to be kind of the leading world power, right? They're going to be a very, very dominant force. And without that dominant force, without the United States, the League of Nations is going to have a lot less power to be able to enforce what they want to enforce. Also coming out of the First World War was the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles is extremely punitive. This is especially levied against Germany for the destruction from the war. France especially is a big proponent of this. They are pushing for this treaty to be more and more harmful to Germany, right? They kind of had the most of the destruction, so they are hoping for the most reparations. Now, as we know, the harshness of the Treaty of Versailles later is going to inspire Hitler, a lot of his ideology, and it's going to be one of the causes that leads to World War II. After World War II is done, we once again have these feelings wanting peace. The United Nations was created in 1945 with the San Francisco Conference. This unites 50 nations. NATO is drafted just 4 years later in 1949. The same year, 1949, the Council of Europe is established. This is kind of the earliest predecessor to the European Union. Now, the Council of Europe isn't, quite as big as the European Union is today. This is mostly focused on promoting democracy and especially human rights, right? With the rise of communism coming out of the Soviet Union, and we also have human rights being violated, obviously, in this post Holocaust world, this European Union is really looking to address those issues. Now, the French foreign minister, Robert Schuman, wanted even deeper European cooperation. Just like in World War I, France was one of the most devastated places from World War II. So now the French government really wants this cooperation so they don't have to be destroyed, they don't have to be damaged in any future conflicts. Now, Schumann was a member of French resistance during World War II. At one point, he was even captured and imprisoned by Nazis. His leadership, along with a man named Jean Monnet, drew up the Schuman Declaration. Now, Jean Monnet never held public office, but he was very influential in the formation of Europe. He even ends up garnering the nickname as the Father of Europe. The Schuman Declaration is what ends up leading to the creation of a series of small organizations that are going to go on to inspire the European Union. In 1951, the European Coal and Steel Community was formed. This was made to encourage economic cooperation between the European states, but also to keep an eye on each other. These nations would need coal and steel to fight a war, right? But if we kind of tie all our coal and steel assets up together, then one of us can't go picking from it without the other one's noticing. So basically, one of these nations can't go mobilizing their army without kind of tipping off any of these other nations. By 1957, the European Economic Community, or EEC, and the European Atomic Energy Community is created. These largely involve just Western European countries, as we see the Iron Curtain dividing Eastern and Western Europe. In 1961, the Berlin Wall is built, which really solidifies that, right? We have a democratic, largely capitalist Western Europe, and we have the communist Eastern Europe under the Soviet Union. Now, in April 1965, we see a treaty merging the European Coal and Steel Community, the EEC, and the European Atomic Energy Community into a single body. In January of 1973, this single body gains its first new members: Denmark, Ireland, and the United Kingdom. Before those three join, the organization contains Western Germany, France, Italy, Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. Now, the UK had not originally joined for a few reasons. Charles de Gaulle, president of France at the time of the forming of these early committees, he vetoed British entry. And this is for a couple of reasons. De Gaulle originally kind of blamed farming interests. He said that agriculture made up a larger part of France's economy than that of the United Kingdom. Because of this, early committees were focusing on agriculture, which he felt that the United Kingdom would not care for, and they wouldn't participate as much in these councils. More importantly, though, is that de Gaulle felt the UK was too close to the United States, and he thought that they would represent American interests more than European interests. And de Gaulle really wants this to become a very European organization, not necessarily a global one. Interestingly enough, though, the creation of what would become the European Union was very much inspired by the United States. In 1946, Winston Churchill even called for the building of a, quote, kind of United States of Europe. Now, through the 1980s, Greece, Spain, and Portugal join after overthrowing dictatorships, and in 1989, the Berlin Wall falls, signaling the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union. Now, while this does pave the way for a more united Europe, we see a lot of conflict in the Balkans, and that's going to be constant through the 1990s. Finally, though, we get to the big date. On the 7th of February 1992, the Maastricht Treaty is signed. This sets rules for a single currency and a new union. This new union, the European Union, Comes into effect November 1st of 1993. Since then, the European Union has amassed a total of 27 countries, from Portugal to Finland. Other countries, including Ukraine, have applied to join and are being considered for candidacy. In 2020, the UK officially left the European Union. Brexit will have to be a conversation for another time, but this definitely shakes things up. So now we know how the EU came to be. What does it do, right? What's the purpose? Well, according to the European Union's website, they seek to promote supranational trade, peace, justice, and improvement in technology, health, and economic growth. This brings us to our second topic, that is the Balfour Declaration. This comes into effect November 2nd of 1917. This is a piece of writing from British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour writing to Lord Rothschild, leader of the British Jewish community. Following anti-Semitism in Russia and the burgeoning anti-Semitism in Western Europe, this letter expressed sympathy for the Jewish people, and more importantly, it, quote, favored the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Now keep in mind, this letter is sent during World War I. So what's the deal? Well, first we need to understand the land itself. At the time, the Ottoman Empire was still around. I briefly mentioned them with our last topic. They are part of the Central Powers during World War I. Britain, France, Russia, and eventually the United States are part of the Entente, or Allied forces, so they're on opposite sides. The Ottoman Empire controls a huge chunk of the Middle East. Now, the British are looking to topple the Ottoman Empire and divide up the land for themselves, and for the French. During the earlier years of the war, we see the Hussein-McMahon correspondence. These take place between Hussein ibn Ali of Mecca and Sir Henry McMahon of the British. Now, Hussein was technically a part of the Ottoman Empire, but he was representing Arabs that were starting to dissent from the empire and they were hoping for autonomy. The correspondence involved the Arabs under Hussein rising up against the Ottomans if they could have autonomy after the war. The British were hoping that they could help them defeat the Ottoman Empire and the British would support development of independent Arab states, including Palestine. Although this was discussed, it was a very largely publicized correspondence. A formal agreement was never settled on. Later, the British decided to kick the Arabs out of the conversation. In 1916, the Sykes-Picot Agreement divided up the land that, at the time, was controlled by the Ottoman Empire. However, the Allied powers were expecting them to be defeated and wanted to get ahead of the curve by dividing up these lands ahead of time. These divisions went through multiple changes, but most importantly for our discussion is that the French ceded their portion of Palestine to the British. So now, the year is 1917, and the British are soon to control the entirety of Palestine. So we have the land. What now? Now we need to understand why a Jewish state was desired and where this came from. To do that, we have to take a step back to 1897. In the late 19th and early 20th century, anti-Semitism was really heating up in Europe. We won't see the Holocaust for another 30 to 40 years, but Jews are being killed, especially in Russia. The widespread European anti-Semitism leads to Jews becoming more politically active and eventually lobbying for their own land. This is when we see the creation of the Zionist movement. The Zionist movement was a movement created in the hope for a Jewish homeland. Palestine was considered first and foremost for this homeland. The leader of this new Zionist movement, Theodor Herzl. Considered to be the father of Zionism, Herzl grew up in Austria-Hungary and went on to become a lawyer. He soon realized the problems that Jews faced in Europe and thought the only solution would be a Jewish state. In 1896, Herzl published Der Judenstaat, a pamphlet detailing this new Zionist movement. This makes the Zionist movement really pick up speed. About a year later, the first Zionist Congress meets. This is a meeting of Zionist leaders from across the world, all kind of gathering on this issue. And most importantly, trying to press these leading nations like Britain into helping them establish this homeland. During World War I, the Brits thought that the Jews could help them win the war. They thought that there were enough of them to make a substantial enough difference, so they decided that supporting this new Zionist movement could kind of garner them some support from the Jewish community. In this environment, we finally get the Balfour Declaration. This officially supports the creation of a Jewish state. Well, what about the Palestinians? The largely Arabic Palestinian population wasn't exactly consulted about this whole arrangement. Following the end of World War I, and thus the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the British took over and started setting up this new Jewish state. This is going to be officially sanctioned in 1920, an international meeting in San Remo, Italy. This sets up the British Mandate of Palestine, shadowing it as a parent organization while establishing it with some Jewish autonomy. This also sets up the rest of the area previously occupied by the Ottoman Empire as Arab states, granting them somewhat self-determination. This still keeps Palestine as a home for Jews, though not a self-determined Arab political state. What about the Arabs living in Palestine, though? By 1922, only 10% of the population in Palestine were Jews. The rest were mostly Arabic Christians or Muslims. There was no concrete solution for this at the time. Arabs and Jews were expected to coexist according to the British Mandate over Palestine. However, obviously, this was not the case. Conflicts over the region continue today. Now, any further discussion would be outside of our scope, right? We want to primarily discuss the Balfour Declaration today, but I am sure that we'll be visiting this topic again in the future, so we can kind of flesh that out a little bit more then. This was how a Jewish homeland was set up in Israel and kind of how these tensions originated. Now we'll move on to our third topic. Imagine this. The year is 1957. World War II is over 10 years past, but the Cold War is in full swing. What starts as an arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union quickly becomes a space race. How? A satellite. 2 years earlier, US President Dwight D. Eisenhower announced that they planned to launch a satellite during the International Geophysical Year, or IGY. This was the year between July of 1957 and December of 1958, focused on an international sharing of scientific discoveries, particularly anything having to do with space. While this was meant to open communication, especially between the East and the West, it really just created new competition. 4 days after the US press release, the Soviet Union also claimed that they would launch a satellite. So who could do it first? What you just heard was Sputnik 1. In October of 1957, the Soviet Union launches Sputnik, literally meaning satellite. This was the first artificial satellite to be sent into space. And the Soviet Union was the first to do it. After the successful first launch of Sputnik, the Soviet Union planned on another just a month later. Sputnik 1 simply released that beep beep radio signal that could be heard around the world before its batteries eventually died and burned up on re-entry. Why do the Russians want to launch another satellite just a month after their original? Well, November of 1957 marked the 40th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, which we're going to be talking about next week. So, because of this, the Soviet Union had to ramp it up, not just launch another basic satellite. So this time, they decided to launch a dog into space. Meet Laika. Laika was born in 1954. She was originally just a stray on the streets of Moscow, but soon achieved international fame. She was one of 3 dogs selected to train to fly in the satellite. Laika performed the best in tests, and so she was sent. Soviet scientists only had a month to design Laika's spacecraft. This would later lead to some issues. Top of that, the technology for re-entry had not yet been developed, so it was never really expected that Laika would survive the trip. With only 1 month to develop the technology, they didn't have enough time to be able to make it able to re-enter the atmosphere, or to install proper systems to keep the cabin cool. Still, the trip was approved to go. So, on November 3rd of 1957, Sputnik 2 was launched with Laika in the cabin. At first, Laika's heart rate and respiration skyrocketed. Sensors in the spacecraft transmitted this data back to Soviet scientists who could see that she was in distress. While Sputnik had a successful launch, part of the spacecraft did not detach as planned. This prevented thermal control systems from working as they were supposed to. On top of that, some of the thermal insulation on the craft tore loose and raised the cabin temperature to 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Even under this heat and stress, Laika's heart rate settled down after about 4 hours and she was recorded eating her food. But the cabin continued to heat. After 5 hours, there were no signs of life left in the cabin. Laika died. But she is forever memorialized as the first living being in space. The Soviet Union had put poisoned food in the cabin that was to be released before her oxygen supply ran out. And initially, that's what they claimed happened. Even in a highly controlled Soviet Union, there were still a lot of critiques on animal testing after Laika's death. Laika's former trainer later critiqued the mission, saying, quote, "We did not learn enough from the mission to justify the death of the dog." After the collapse of the Soviet Union, nearly 40 years after Laika's death, the true causes of her death were revealed. Sputnik continued to circle the Earth for 5 months after Laika's death. It, and Laika's remains, burned up on re-entry on April 14th of 1958. Laika was memorialized in a variety of ways across the Soviet Union and as late as 2008. Artists continue to memorialize her today, including the film studio Laika, who's known for making films like Coraline and Kubo and the Two Strings. Hopefully, on a more cheerful note, we can now talk about a famous birthday. Every week, I'll be talking about a famous birthday that happened on this day in history. On November 2nd of 1795, future U.S. President James K. Polk is born in Pineville, North Carolina. Polk served as president between 1845 and 1849. Polk is most known for his expansion of the United States. Polk gained the Oregon Country from Great Britain, what is now known as Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. He helped annex Texas and was president during the Mexican-American War, which ended with a U.S. victory. This also led to the U.S. gaining a huge chunk of land in the Southwest. That includes California, Nevada, and more. All this new land meant newly inflamed slave tensions, but Polk is overall remembered favorably. Unfortunately, Polk succumbs to cholera just 103 days after his presidency ends. This means Polk had the shortest lifespan of any president not assassinated, but he will always be remembered. And that is going to be it for the first episode of Day by Day. My name is Noah Davis. Thank you guys for tuning in. Join us in a couple days. We're going to be talking a little bit about that Bolshevik Revolution, and we're also going to be talking about the discovery of King Tut's tomb, one of my favorite historical stories. And remember, today is a good day to make history. Bye-bye.